Hello, everybody, and happy Monday. Now, last week we said gold and commodities, they do well during times of chaos. Well, okay, we've got our chaos, and last week we touched upon the military part of it, how the wars in Ukraine are playing out, which isn't going well for us, and how in the Middle East it's difficult to find an off ramp right now, at least long term. But we hinted that there will also be problems with banking, but it's not always banking here in the United States. So now we're going to draw a nexus here between the war in Ukraine and the Bank of England that I didn't know anything about until just recently, but it helps explain a lot. There were times I would go into Walt's office or lean against the door and say, well, I just don't get it. You see, why does England have this hatred for the Russians? I mean, it was just hard to understand the intensity of it. We even had the prime minister, the new prime minister of Britain, coming over to talk to President Biden in September saying, we got to send long range missiles into Russia. And we talked about this last week. The risk of that is really high. What is this all about? It has to do with money. I just found out the Bank of England has been issuing contracts to firms for natural resources in Ukraine going back to 2014. Remember what happened in 2014? There was that revolution inside Ukraine where the Russian kind of guy was thrown out, the pro Ukrainian guy was put in. We had a lot to do with that. And there was this hope that there was going to be all of this economic development for natural resources, which is what we're always talking about, within Ukraine, plus the possibility of an overthrow of Putin and causing instability within Russia, which might open up contracts for coal, oil, lithium all across eastern Ukraine and maybe even into Russia itself. Well, apparently the Bank of England bought into this whole vision and started issuing contracts, loans to companies to go and exploit the resources in that part of the world. Well, now it's not going their way. Now, the Russians are clearly pushing the Ukrainians toward the Dnipro River. That's their Mississippi. We've talked about that before. And all those resources are not in any way going to be under the control of the West, but rather under control of the Russians. Who's on the hook for all those loans? The Bank of England, with no collateral to back it up. And so the money part of this is huge for these guys. And remember what happened to the Bank of England? After Brexit, the European countries pounded on England financially for daring to leave the European Union. They were barely recovering from this when they started to do that. All of these banks are connected. To think that the Bank of England isn't connected with our Federal Reserve and JP Morgan and Citi and the Bank of China and the Hong Kong banks, that's not reasonable. Thus, we may have banking issues just coming from the other side of the Atlantic that we had no idea about that go back a decade in its stupidity and its greed. So, again, we're back to this good news, bad news thing. I hate that all this stuff is going on out there. What a mess. At the same time, the chaos thing that we laid out in January 2024, year of chaos, it's going to be good for the metals. It's all playing out. It's all going to be good for you, we believe. And so with that, next week, we'll go to China. More good news out of the banking sector in China. We'll get into that next week. In the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Walt.